Hello and welcome to the Weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. This week we are brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Viasat. I am your host, Richard Thomas, Senior Editor Naval, and on the show this week, we tackle the tracks versus wheels armoured vehicle debate and look at the new Russian kit that was on display at the Victory Day parade held in Moscow on the 24th of June. But first, let's take a look at some of the headlines from this week. Cross-party political talks in Sweden addressing future defence funding have collapsed following disagreement over whether additional money should be approved. The Swedish government will not commit to any extra funding for the 2026 to 2030 period until the economic impact of COVID-19 can be better assessed. This is despite a push by opposition parties for an extra 5 billion krona to be added to the defence budget. In Singapore, the government insists it will not compromise on the acquisition of strategic capabilities despite some tightening of belts. Due to COVID-19 and supply chain disruptions, a handful of procurement programs are being delayed by up to a year. In his annual review, Defence Minister Nang Eng-hen said that the H225M and Chinook helicopter deliveries will shift from late 2020 to early 2021. The first Type 218 SG submarine delivery from Germany is delayed by a year to 2022, although F-35B procurement apparently remains on track. In the naval domain, a new report by the UK National Audit Office points towards continued delays in fielding the Joint Force Carrier Strike capability, centred around the Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers. The slow acquisition of over-budget F-35Bs and severe delays to the rotary-borne Crow's Nest AEW system are two of the main warnings issued by the NAO, which cast doubt that the 2023 deadline for the Carrier Strike full operational capability will be met. The report also said that the MOD may not have made sufficient provision in future budgets for the full cost of maintaining a carrier-based strike group, which, in an economy that will shrink as a result of the pandemic, is likely to be a long-term problem. So to discuss this and more, I'm joined by Air Editor Tim Martin and Land Reporter Flavia Camargo-Pereira. Hi both.
Hi Rich.
Hello.
Tim, I wanted to bring you in here as the NAO report straddles both of our desks. If you'll forgive me, there's a bit of a preamble. From the naval perspective, the carriers, disregarding whether we think they're the right fit for the service, which itself was a fairly lively debate I had on social media, ended up costing over £6 billion to build, around double the original budget. Look at the Lightning programme, costs have risen, by 15% since 2017 to more than £10 billion. And getting Crow's Nest capability functioning before the planned 2021 deployment of Queen Elizabeth is going to be tight. So that's two air domain programmes over budget, delayed. What's your take?
Yeah, the take is, I suppose, that it's slightly alarming, certainly with respect to Crow's Nest, that this delay has only been brought to light now. And I say that because the summary from the NAO points to contractual commitments from Thales, the subcontractor of Crow's Nest, being problematic, and they didn't disclose the project's progress in a timely manner. Is there something that they have to hide on that, or why have they not come forward and mentioned that to the MOD? I think is quite interesting. And then secondly, the NAO of course doesn't do any favours for the MOD because on this delay itself, because it says that neither the MOD nor its prime contractor Lockheed Martin were aware of these problems until it was too late, and that reflects ineffective oversight, to use their quote, with the contract with Lockheed Martin. So, they come in for a bit of a hammering here, both the MOD and the contractors and subcontractors. And as you say, the ultimate result is that the delay of 18 months for Crow's Nest IOC, and then the 11 months for FOC, which is now May 2023, is very significant to the capability going forward. So, yeah, I think it's very unfortunate, and if Thales have got this right, which I think the NAO are suggesting that there have been some changes, and the problems that are afoot have been put to right, but it's still unclear as to why exactly the problems happened in the first place. So whether we learn of those issues further down the line remains to be seen, I guess.
We shouldn't be that surprised, though, should we? Because the February's NEO report into the UK Defence Equipment Plan said that only 5 of more than 30 key programmes would actually be delivered on time. So this is just a recurring problem for the MOD.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I mean, I've not to plug a feature of mine that's forthcoming, but I've been writing on RAF modernisation, and it is very obvious that a lot of these delays are now beginning to have an impact. For example, you look at even the UAV side, Protector is delayed. Initially in 2016, the plan was that they would transition and be in service by 2020. That's now 2023. But sorry, on F-35, we shouldn't forget, because that was the point of the NAO's report as well. They talk about that. There is a slight delay, of course, because of COVID and the international programme, and we know that the slowdown in production has happened mainly because supplier deliveries happening again in a timely fashion have been more difficult for Lockheed Martin, and they've as much as admitted that, so they'll miss their delivery target for the end of the year. And UK, of course, have 18 delivered. The contract is for 48. What will be most interesting is, with the delayed integrated review, is how much funding goes towards the new aircraft, and also because there's overblown spending on software and weapons integration and the stuff that the NAO mentioned. Well, how much is going to now have to be brought forward to allow for more of that? So there's certainly big decisions ahead. And in terms of the carrier strike capability, certainly there seems to be bad news potentially on the way than maybe good news.
Indeed. Okay, Tim, elsewhere, you've got some news from Westminster this week and the latest update in what I'm going to coin the great 5G saga of Britain. So, the floor is yours.
Very nice title too, Rich. So Ben Wallace, the Secretary of Defence, was sitting before the Defence Subcommittee this week, and the point of him taking questions was to look at 5G, as you say, and Huawei, and the current situation with the UK. So there's one very clear distinction that must be made, and which he did make, because, to go back first and foremost, the UK government has instructed the National Cybersecurity Centre to undertake a review addressing the feasibility of introducing Huawei across 5G. And, that's in the civil sphere as well as the defence sphere potentially. I suppose the controversy has come, and the instruction to undertake that review is based on US sanctions being placed on Huawei, and in a geopolitical context, plans for China to introduce a security law in Hong Kong are an additional kind of headache for parliamentarians, or for the political, or as worsen the political issue, let's say. So the distinction here that Ben Wallace made very clear was that Huawei is not has no part to play in any of the military bases or secure locations that the UK MOD have under their charge. He also said that, that in the future, that's not a target either. And to be fair, the government on this, they want to remove what they describe as high-risk vendors from any contracts moving forward on 5G. Now, they wouldn't be drawn on when exactly that'll happen. There is no timeline, as far as I can make out from what was said yesterday, as to when they get to no high-risk vendors on the supply chain for that. But in terms of the UK defence position, it's very clear that Huawei won't be involved in any of their secure networks. So it's in part really a non-issue now. Yes, it's obviously a very bigger concern for the UK government as a whole, but certainly it seems to be less of an issue for defence.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a supplier of microchips or transistors for Huawei's technology that was based in Taiwan, I think it was given an ultimatum, according to media reports, by the US, that it would either supply its technology to China or the US, but certainly not both. And as I understand it, media reports suggested that the decision by the Taiwanese company was that it would side with the US. So I think Huawei's got difficulties moving forward in the technology it has access to. I want to just ask you about the sort of the national cybersecurity issue in a second, But just scanning through Huawei's UK website, just to outline how busy the company's been over the past month or so. In May, it signed a new 5-year deal with Imperial College, which will see Huawei provide 5G and cloud capabilities onto one of Imperial's campuses. 8th of June, open letter to the UK by Huawei VP Victor Zhang tries to reassure people, saying that the company grew up in the UK. It had been here for 20 years and was integral in building the 3G and 4G networks that we all use today. And just a week or so ago, Huawei was granted planning permission to build a £1 billion research campus near Cambridge. The company's not going to leave UK shores, is it?
No, I don't think there's any question of that. I mean, I think that the bigger question is the UK, you could frame this as having to pick its poison, so to speak. And maybe it's not the greatest use of the term, but whether they want to continue and have a limited role for Huawei in 5G networks is one thing, or do they simply side with the US and say that these sanctions make it impossible for any future role for Huawei to be involved here. And the findings, I think what's key here is that the findings of the National Cybersecurity Centre, their report to review those sanctions and to view exactly that issue are now being finally discussed. There was the Oliver Dowden, who's the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, said that they're going through the final stages of the report and that'll determine if policy changes are going to happen. So we'll find out one way or the other what happens next very, very soon. But I think that's the crux of the debate here. As I mentioned, it's absolutely not helped by the international response to China introducing the security law in Hong Kong. Let's wait and see. But my feeling on it, is that there will be a U-turn made by the government fairly soon.
So back to the cybersecurity issue, you made a really good point earlier. The MOD embarks on its own IT program over the past several years. I think it's called the Defence Information Infrastructure, which, it should be said, also ran massively over budget. That's not a surprise, is it? This infrastructure was delivered by a consortium called Atlas, which, of course, did not include Huawei. So is this less of a defence-only question and more, as you said before, of a national cybersecurity issue?
Yeah, definitely. I think to give credits to Ben Wallace, he came out very strongly on this because he was also asked that even though Huawei isn't used in RAF bases and things like that, is there a possibility that someone perhaps within one of those secure sites could use a mobile phone and log on through a BT provider, and there's an overlap then potentially with Huawei software or something like that? And he said, and I don't want to misquote him, but he as much as said that if there was someone working in a department that would use a personal mobile phone or something like that, they'd be in breach of other defence and security policies and things like that. That would be much more of a serious matter. So yes, while there is some very extreme circumstance that perhaps someone could be using Huawei in the UK defence setup, it would be completely unheard of, to be using a personal mobile phone or something like that, and to use in that way. But I think when he described it in those terms, I did get a fairly strong sense that the defence position on the matter is pretty much nailed on and fairly closed here. That it's not really a discussion in any meaningful way, and that it's for the Secretary of State more so for digital culture, media and sport to discuss the future in a kind of more civil setting or for security settings outside of defence.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting. Okay, to Flavia then. You have some news from the land domain, of course. You have a story, I believe, from Spain, which is looking to enhance NBC capabilities. So please do tell us more.
Yeah, actually, the Spanish armed forces spent around 3 months engaged in the Operation Balmis to fight the outbreak of the COVID-19 they were supporting the civilian authorities, and this operation highlighted the importance of maintaining and improving the NBC capabilities. And during a webinar, the Spanish Army presented its priorities in terms of NBC equipment, systems, and technology, what they will need, what they intend to have by 2035. They didn't present any details about the budget, but they presented the needs of the NEBC Defense Regiment Valencia 1 and the needs of the military emergency unit. Basically, the NBC regiment needs a range of material from uniforms to unmanned platforms and new generation devices, and they want to have disruptive technologies for the soldier level to the brigade level. In terms of soldier systems, they are looking for portable sensors, uniforms with control dots that will be able to identify and destroy NBC traits through photodegradation. Also, they intend to have vehicles and armored platforms with CBRN capabilities and a collective system for NBC protection. In terms of battalion, they intend to have NBC technology integrated into a command and control system, and this technology would be able to forecast and to manage the NBC capabilities. In terms of brigade, the needs include unmanned vehicles, unmanned aerial and ground vehicles, a central control system able to alert and predict NBC traits, and a complete decontamination station. And at divisional and headquarters level, they intend to have crewed armored vehicles with NBC capabilities, unmanned ground vehicles, and mobile laboratories.
I mean, it was back in February, I think, I was attending a conference in Singapore when I first heard military officials speaking of a need to adapt operations to what they called a new biosphere. So attention is clearly being brought to ensuring forces have the required kit. What ambitions does the Spanish Army have regarding the provision of new medical screening and decontamination systems?
Yeah, actually, they presented the needs of the military emergency unit. That's basically a healthy unit. And they are looking for simulators to identify NBC traits, simulators to create situations in which the military could train. And they also intend to have software able to predict NBC traits. And they are interested as well on ultraviolet technology and robotic systems that can perform sanitization. It will be super useful for them because during the Balmis operation, basically, these soldiers were performing these tasks. So if they have the possibility to use robotic systems, they would improve their performance much more. And also in this direction, they intend to have an automated decontamination station. People you don't need to touch. It'll be much easier from them to perform this sanitization. And also they intend to have a mobile medical facility, such as a bus, because they realized during the Balmis, the Operation Balmis, that it was hard for them to transport only one patient per vehicle. So they realized if they had vehicles like a bus, they could use only one medical team and they could transport much more patients at the same time.
Do all these capabilities that you're talking about, do they tally with an overall force development program or are they just being developed ad hoc and on the fly?
Yeah, to be honest, they are completely related to the Force 2035 program, because this program, it intends to upgrade the capabilities of the Spanish army and also the military doctrine. So they have in this program plans to procure or to develop technologies to ensure the readiness of the Spanish troops for the battlefield of the future. And including this program, it has NBC priorities as well. And these priorities are completely related to these priorities that were presented during this webinar. They are basically following the guidelines of the Force 2035 program.
Yeah, thanks, Flavia. To our listeners, for all the news discussed in this episode and much more, visit our website, shepherdmedia.com. Coming up next, I talk to Sonny Butterworth, Senior Analyst Land at Shephard's Defence Insight team on the tracks versus wheels debate and find out where global militaries are investing their money.
During the chaos of combat, warfighters need fast, secure communications and instant access to information. But the digital information age we know today has changed the nature of warfare across the air, land and sea domains. Military commanders are acutely aware that new networks, systems and technologies are needed to ensure timely and effective communications. This is Shephard Studios' podcast series on Five Eyes connectivity, sponsored by our partner Viasat. In Series 1, we looked at connectivity issues facing the Five Eyes grouping of countries: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US, through the prism of three key technology areas. For the second series, we will dive further into these issues and speak to senior military leaders about the work underway to ensure they have constant and unfettered access across the electromagnetic spectrum. Series 2 of the Five Eyes Connectivity podcast will be available later in 2020 on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
After a decade and a half of counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, where wheeled mobility was considered paramount and defence observers became accustomed to new acronyms like the MRAP, the emerging new era of great power competition has once again pushed the notion of tracked and heavily armoured warfare back to the fore. Joining me on the Weekly Defence podcast to get the tracks versus wheels debate rolling is Defence Insight Senior Analyst Land, Sonny Butterworth. Sonny, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Richard.
Sonny, I get the feeling that tracks are on the way back, but if the US Marine Corps has opted to decide that it will no longer field main battle tanks, just how clear-cut is it?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right to point out that the last sort of few decades, particularly for the armoured vehicles market, the wheeled side of things has been dominant. It's been where most of the investment is. But having said that, tracked vehicles have still remained an integral part of all militaries. We're still seeing substantial investment into tracked vehicles. I suppose the difference is that many of the tracked vehicles in operation, particularly in, say, Western Europe and the US, they're based on designs now that are really from the Cold War. They have, of course, been substantially upgraded, so we're still seeing lots of attention put into the tracked vehicles, but most of the new procurement has been on the wheeled side. But it's important to note, again, that there's been a lot of activity still on the tracked side of things, so we're seeing new technological developments like composite rubber tracks. So really, the wheeled side of things has been very important, but the tracks are still there in the background. I think it also depends on where you look too. So, as I said, if you look at Europe, then the wheel, the 8x8 armoured vehicles in particular have captured a lot of attention recently. But also, if you go to the Asia Pacific, there's been much more investment into tracked vehicles. So main battle tank programs, really in all of the major countries in that region: China, India, South Korea, you name it. So it's really the tracked versus wheels debate. I mean, I can see why it has a lot of utility in terms of looking at the technological side of things, and of course also the market. but really maybe we should talk about tracks and wheels because they're still ultimately complementary in the way militaries use them.
It's interesting you mentioned the geographical discrepancies or disparities between tracked or wheeled vehicle development programs. For me, I would have thought that the open land masses of, say, Eurasia would be well suited to tracked battlegrounds, while the archipelagic countries of Southeast Asia maybe would be more concentrating on amphibious warfare or wheeled. But from what you were saying there, it's actually the other way around, that a lot of the developments in tracked armoured vehicle programs is coming from Southeast Asia. Yeah,
it is very interesting. I think really a lot of that is to do with the fact that, as we said in the last couple of decades, particularly Europe and America, they've been looking at projecting their power overseas. So that has a very big impact on the kind of vehicles that they want. Because when we talk about mobility in terms of armoured vehicles, we're really looking at three types of mobility. We're looking at strategic mobility, so that's getting the vehicles to where they need to be, and that is often determined really by dimensions, by weight. So how you can fit them in airplanes, in ships, on road and rail transports to get them to where they can make a difference. Then you have the operational mobility. So once they're in the theatre, how do they then travel to the battlefield? And that's traditionally where the wheeled vehicles have the edge, because travelling on tyres, they can get up to much faster speeds on the road. They can travel for much longer distances under their own power. They usually have better fuel efficiency. But then you also have the tactical mobility. So once they're on the battlefield, how well can they negotiate all the obstacles they might encounter? How can they manoeuvre around the battlefield easily? And that's usually where tracked vehicles tend to have advantage, because with tracks you can go places simply that wheeled vehicles still can't go. And this is usually in the kind of the extremes. So it's the snow, it's the sand, really kind of those most challenging conditions. That's where the tracks have the edge. And so I think that's why for the most recent sort of years, we've seen a lot of investment into wheeled vehicles, because for planners in Western militaries, it's been about actually getting the armoured vehicles to the battlefield and then making a difference. So, whether that's in the Middle East or somewhere like that, or even perhaps just making sure that they're actually in, say, the Balkans, ready to counter a Russian invasion. I think you also have to take into account that like a region like the Asia Pacific, there's actually many, many different types of terrain there. So yes, there certainly are areas where tracked vehicles are not the most practical. And I think that's why we've seen in the Asia Pacific region, some countries opting to start now to go for what you might call light or medium tanks, where the weight is significantly reduced and they have more manoeuvrability in, say, jungles, or can easily be shipped across the different islands to get where they need to be. But having said that, there's also vast plains as well where, traditional tanks are very useful. And so most of the countries in the region have very large fleets, particularly when compared to Western Europe. Yeah, so I think it's like I say, every country really wants a balance of the two capabilities. I think really France is the one that's gone the furthest in any direction with their predominantly wheeled fleet now, but still their tanks, the Clerk, they're still going to be tracked, and so will their future platform as well.
You mentioned some of the tech developments that's going on in the tracks and wheels for tracks. You mentioned rubber tracks. And what other developments might help further these kind of platforms? A lot of them, as you said, are aging, and in some cases aging quite badly. So what might the next generation of platforms, tracks and wheels, look like?
Yeah, I think so. For tracks, the composite rubber tracks developed by companies like Susi, but there's others as well that make them like Deal.
Sorry, Sonny, and what does that do? What would a composite rubber track do? So
compared to steel tracks, they have several advantages, really. So in terms of fuel consumption, they're generally much more efficient. I mean, I think I've seen figures for like 25% fuel savings. They also have sort of better running on the road. So you have reduced vibration, reduced noise, and all that kind of has an effect on, first of all, the crew, who have a better time being inside the vehicle, so they're less fatigued. Actually being shaken about in an armoured vehicle can have some sort of negative health impacts over time as well. So it's just generally better from a kind of ergonomic perspective, not just for the crew, but also for the components of the vehicle as well. So you end up having, over time, quite considerable savings in life cycle costs in maintenance. And I think that's why militaries now are starting to adopt those much more readily. I mean, the technology has been around for quite a while. I mean, actual just rubber band tracks have been around since really the early 1900s, really 1920s, but the composite rubber tracks, where you've got rubber kind of mixed with other materials, that's been around again since about the 90s, early 2000s on some platforms. But now that they're able to cope with greater vehicle weights, we're starting to see them used on things like tracked IFVs. So if you look at Australia's Land 400 Phase 3 program, both the Lynx and the Redback there are going to be equipped with rubber tracks. Milrem has just recently shown photos of its new unmanned ground vehicle. Again, that's using those composite rubber tracks. So I think the reason militaries are looking at these is because, as I mentioned earlier, with some of the disadvantages of tracks on the operational mobility side, being able to travel across roads or long distances, and also generally the higher costs of running the tracked vehicle, that's where the rubber bands can really, or the composite rubber tracks can really make a big difference. So substantial kind of cost savings there.
So how useful then is a debate like this, tracks versus wheels, and how would that debate affect the armoured vehicle market? Isn't it more, as you've touched on, more about doctrine and how a force wants to be able to deploy, like the US Marine Corps?
Yes, I think that's why we've sort of seen that debate come up, and it's been recurring now for several years. Really, yeah, it's about how the armoured vehicles are used, and this kind of emphasis on getting them to all different theatres and being able to transport them easily so that they can make a difference very quickly. I think, as I'm sort of trying to emphasise, I think tracks versus wheels sounds very adversarial, very antagonistic, whereas really we should kind of see the two as complementary. Most militaries are using a mixture of both types. So if we look at British Army, I mean, this has sort of been a subject of contention, but the strike brigades are going to have the Boxer wheeled vehicle, and then the Ajax tracked vehicle, and then the heavier kind of armoured infantry are still going to be using the upgraded Warriors once that progresses, and the Challenger 2 main battle tanks, again, sort of heavy tracked vehicles. So it's not the case, I don't think, that one is necessarily going to displace the other, though, of course, there has been substantial advances in wheeled vehicle technology as well over the years. So things like central tyre inflation systems, better sort of off-road tyres that have somewhat helped to close the gap. But really the fact remains that, there are certain places where wheeled vehicles just can't go and where tracks are needed. So I think in some ways the debate is perhaps overblown. That can as well be useful to look at it from a market perspective, because reflecting those doctrinal shifts, as I sort of mentioned earlier, we have seen over the past sort of decades more investment into MRAPs and 8x8 vehicles, which are wheeled. Whereas now, looking more into the future, it seems that militaries are starting to prioritise refreshing their tracked fleets. And part of that is just the age, because as I said, they've still been recognised as something important to have. They've not just got rid of them, or the militaries that have, like the Netherlands, have then come back and actually purchase more tracked vehicles. So I think part of that is just the kind of the age of the fleets in general, and this kind of belated need that with as you say, perhaps a great power confrontation looking more likely, or at least something that should be prepared for more, that we're going to see much more investment into tracked vehicles.
I mean, you mentioned there, you gave the example of the UK Strike Brigade as a formation that sees the integration of wheeled vehicles and tracked vehicles. Now, I mean, it sounds good in concept, but those platforms you're talking about, they're vastly different size, and there's different logistical chains that need to be catered for. And air transportability. I mean, you've got something like the Boxer compared to the Warrior compared to the Ajax. Those are very, very different sized platforms. I mean, it sounds good as a concept, don't get me wrong, but practically isn't having mixed tracked and wheeled fleets in a brigade just adding more problems to a force in terms of logistics and everything else along with it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like as I say, it's been a subject of contention. I think that's certainly very, very valid point, that it's going to make resupply and just generally make it harder to use the brigade effectively. I think with that mix, I think it would probably have been better to have, say, the recon capability the Ajax has provided actually filled in by a kind of a turreted version of the Boxer, so that the brigade really had that same level of mobility across, and then, like I say, keep the tracked vehicles and the kind of heavier armoured infantry brigades, and then the Challenger 2 tanks as well. So I think when you mix it to that level, as in the strike brigades, that doesn't look good. Yeah, it's certainly going to be difficult, and I think that's why the whole concept has come under quite a bit of criticism from commentators online and in defence media in general.
Yeah, for
There's
sure.
a lot of confusion.
Just finally then, if I can just drag you back to tracks, just how big an industrial effort is it to build a new tracked armoured vehicle, particularly vehicles like main battle tanks? I mean, France and Germany are looking to their new joint Euro tank, but what else is there on the horizon?
Yeah, so if we start with the main ground combat system, the MGCS, that's an effort to develop a whole new next generation platform. And if we say that news has just recently come out that they're starting the system architecture definition study, the first phase of that, and the actual platform is not scheduled to be enter service until 2035. And that's now, when we know with international development programs, there's often quite a bit of potential for delays to be caused. So that's a kind of one end of the spectrum where the development is going to take a long time, more than 10 years. But really the answer does depend as well. So if we look at some of the other avenues that can be taken to develop an MBT, so Turkey's Altay program, for example, where they employed Hyundai Rotem from South Korea as a technical consultant to get them started on the design, that's allowed them to somewhat speed up part of that process, because they're not developing a whole new next generation platform. They're using some of that existing technology. Where the barriers have come from there is, and this is kind of a common stumbling block in main battle tank programs in particular, is the engine, so or the power pack to be precise. So those components generally can't be just taken commercially off the shelf. They have to really be specifically designed for main battle tanks, because you have the space limitations and just the way the power is used by tanks. And we see with the Altay program that they are struggling to develop an indigenous power pack, and they run into trouble importing components from Germany as well. So that sort of set the program back. And you can see the same thing in South Korea as well with their K2. I think the second batch of tanks which were due to use an indigenous engine and an indigenous transmission were pushed back because by about 3 years, and they've now had to basically substitute that indigenous transmission for, again, a German Renk transmission. So it's certainly a protracted process, but there are ways of speeding it up, or if you're going to develop a next generation platform, then you're really in it for the long haul. But part of that, again, is with the MGCS, it's the whole international cooperation side as well, which I think we're going to see much more of in Western Europe, where the domestic industries have somewhat decayed and been neglected over the year. And also, again, the cost constraints, and the latter is only going to, I think, be thrown into more light by the coronavirus, which of course we haven't talked about, but that's looming in the background of all these programs, and that could have a very big effect on the market, particularly as we were expecting to see quite a lot of investment into Central and Eastern European militaries in the 2020s, because taking the threat from Russia, they're kind of right on the front line there, so to speak. So we were expecting to see quite a lot of new programs there. But even sort of looking at the Czech Republic, where a new tracked infantry fighting vehicle was considered one of their most important programs, there have been statements suggesting that actually that program could now potentially be jeopardized or altered to perhaps have more wheeled vehicles, or a reduced budget. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as well, and maybe affects the market going forwards.
Sonny, you mentioned Western Europe, you mentioned manufacturing capability, you mentioned finances, you mentioned COVID-19. What about the UK? I mean, we've got Challenger 2. Could there ever be a new main battle tank for the UK on the horizon? Or is the country, given that it's divested so much of its armoured manufacturing capability, is it just going to have to join another international programme in the US, or even the joint French-German? What do you think?
I think that we're going to see a move towards international cooperation. I think that there will certainly be an emphasis on trying to get British industry involved as much as possible. And I think that would be the same of any other country that opts to go this way. I mean, another country that's clearly stated an intention to develop a main battle tank internationally is Italy. So it's possible they may look to join the MGCS with France and Germany, or perhaps we may even see a bit kind of like a Tempest with a rival block foreman as well. It's very early stages as yet. But I think the days of a pure kind of British main battle tank that's operated by Britain and then is tried to be, or is, they attempt to export it to other countries, that seems over to me. I think the Challenger 2 was the last example of that. And of course, it's worth noting as well that we haven't really heard much about the Challenger 2's life extension program upgrade recently as well. So that's another one to keep an eye on and see whether it's deemed worth putting the money into that upgrade when ultimately Britain wants a new tank, again, probably to enter service in the mid-2030s.
Well, on that very sombre note, Sonny, thanks for your time. I hope to all the listeners we've added some interesting insight to the debate about tracks versus wheels, or even if it should be a debate on tracks versus wheels, maybe it's something more collaborative. Sonny Butterworth, Senior Analyst Land, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks.
Hey, have you been using the Defense Insight tool that we signed up to the other month?
Have I? It's so useful. Being able to call up all those equipment entries and compare specs. I'm not sure how we got by without it.
I know, right? But they've also just launched the Defense Insight Program Index, which is now live on the dashboard.
Oh, I've been looking forward to that. This covers both the current and forecast requirements across all major platforms, right?
It sure does. The dashboard now gives us access to really detailed program information, including requirement data, total spending, contract award years, and first delivery year.
This is great. It links suppliers, bidders, and the system being offered with direct links to the equipment entry pages.
Yeah, and you can export all program and forecasting data. It's going to be so useful for that super urgent project the boss has me working on. Looking at wheeled armored vehicle programs over the next 10 years.
For Defense Insight subscribers, the much-anticipated Program Index is now live on your dashboard. Covering current and forecast requirements across all major systems, the Program Index accounts for 80% of global defense spending. Access this latest upgrade today through Defense Insight by Shephard Media.
More than 13,000 Russian soldiers marched through Red Square in the rescheduled Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 24th of June, with 216 military vehicles and 75 aircraft on show. The parade should have taken place on the 9th of May, but it was postponed amid the COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak. With me on the line from Yerevan is our correspondent, Leonid Nersisyan. Leonid, hello, how are you?
Hello, Ben. I'm fine. And how are you doing?
Not too bad, all things considered. We're here to talk about the Victory Parade, and there was an aircraft fly past, a tank procession, as is common during these events. But I thought we would focus in our chat here on artillery systems. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the big brand new aspect of the Victory Parade, which is the ISDM.
That's a really interesting piece of military equipment because there was very little information about it before. ISDM is an abbreviation of Remote Mine Laying System, which is in reality a 122 millimeter multiple launcher rocket system. So it's mounted on 8-on-8 Kamaz chassis, and it has 50 barrels. So it's firing almost the same missiles as BM-21 Grad MRLS, but it's firing missiles only containing various types of mines.
Was there the possibility, or is there still the possibility that the Grad MLRS that you mentioned could be somehow upgraded to perform a similar function?
I don't think that it's a big problem, and I'm really surprised that a special piece of equipment was designed only for mine laying. So I don't know why this decision was made, but it's really interesting. Maybe this ISDM will be also used like a classical MLRS and will launch all types of 122 millimeter rockets, but yet there is not much information about this piece of equipment.
Okay, so it sounds like it might be a versatile piece of kit. Meanwhile, what did you see in terms of the self-propelled howitzers at the parade?
We saw the Koalicja 152 millimeter self-propelled howitzer, which had been displayed in previous victory parades, but this time we saw Koalicja with two radar devices located on the turret, and that was a bit surprising. There is no available information about what these radars are doing and what is their function, but some experts assume that it can be used for correcting of the fire, own fire, or it can possibly be used to detect trajectory of enemy shells. So,
right, and previous versions of Koalicja have not been seen with any kind of radar attachment. Is that correct?
That's right. It's first time we see Koalicja with radars.
That's interesting. And of course, as you mentioned, the Grad before, Russia has a long-standing expertise with multiple launch rocket systems. And we can think all the way back to the Second World War with Katyusha and Stalin Organ. But what did you notice this year in terms of the latest evolutions?
We saw the Tornado S 300 millimeter MRLS, the heavy MRLS, and this is the new version of BM-30 Smerch, which is pretty well known. But this system have some new navigation system and new automated fire control system. Also, Tornado S is using new missiles, which have maximum range of up to 120 kilometers. These missiles can be used with BM-30 Smerch also, and also some satellite-guided missile is under development, and this will allow to use single missile to fire at a target. Before, it was about firing a full battery burst over a wide area, even if the target was small.
So we're talking here about a precision strike capability.
Yes. And I think this is really important for Russia because many countries are already producing this satellite-guided missiles for MRLS, and that was a big problem that Russia lacked this weapon.
So in terms of the satellite system that it would use, we're talking here about GLONASS, aren't we, or GPS as well?
Usually, they give an option to use all kinds of satellite navigation, so it will be both GLONASS and GPS.
Okay, that would add to the versatility, I suppose. Also on parade, there was a new feature for the Pantsir surface-to-air missile system or anti-aircraft system. And now Russian forces have been using Pantsir S-1 in Syria and in combat operations. So, Leonid, what kind of lessons have been applied to future development of Pantsir from that experience?
This experience was about the widespread use of UAVs, even by some irregular forces, and the use of loitering munition, like Israeli-made or Turkish-made. So this was an interesting and not a very good experience, which made pretty big update and upgrade to Pantsir system. Now the Panther SM system has a new radar. It has more stable Tornado K chassis, and it has missiles with twice the range of the Panther S1, and also some small and inexpensive anti-UAV missiles were installed on the system in batches of 4. And I think that's a good idea because it's very expensive to use standard anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down some small and cheap drones.
So a budget solution for a budget problem. If the drones are cheap, then the missiles are going to be fairly basic to shoot them down.
Yes, because small drones are not a very difficult targets, and you don't need to use, $200,000 missile to shoot it down. When this drone costs like $5,000, that's just not making sense.
Indeed, it sounds a bit financially like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You mentioned the range of the missiles on Panzer SM as doubling the range compared to legacy systems. So, in terms of kilometers, are we talking about here?
40 kilometers versus 20 kilometers on the Panzer S1.
We can talk actually, Leonid, a little bit more about some of the other equipment that was on display. Main battle tanks, the T-90, the Armata, I expect, were seen. Were there any surprises that you noticed there?
Not really. There was nothing really surprising, but we saw the interesting thing, 4 types of tanks, main battle tanks, in one place, which is a little bit strange. I think that you can't remember any other country which is using 4 kinds of main battle tanks. Am I right, Ben?
I assume you are, Leonid. Yes, I think you may well be correct. And I suppose if I was a resident of a country neighbouring Russia at the moment, I particularly in Eastern Europe, I may get a little bit nervous at the sight of 4 different types of main battle tank roaring down the street in Moscow.
I don't really think that it's a good thing to have 4 types of main battle tanks because the function is the same. And having T-72B3, having T-90M, having T-80 BVM and having Armata, I think it's a little bit too much.
I imagine there are problems, potential problems with maintenance and logistics associated with keeping these different types of battle tank in the field. That is, if all 4 of them do end up being fielded.
Of course, you are right, because like T-80 and T-72 platforms are pretty similar, but if you look at this topic more detailed, you will see that almost every spare part is different, and you can't use spare parts of T-72 to fix the T-80, and that's a big problem. And these tanks have very similar specifications. Of course, T-80 is using another type of engine, but basically, it's almost the same tank.
So let me put you on the spot then, Leonid. If there are 4 types of main battle tank, either in development or approaching maturity and production, what's your money on in terms of the most likely main battle tank to succeed in Russia?
I think T-70B3 already succeeded because hundreds of basic T-72s were upgraded to this level. I think T-90M will be produced in something like 100 or 200 pieces, not more than that. And if we are talking about Armata, it won't be a very big, large-scale serial production in the next 4 or 5 years, but maybe 5 years, after 5 years or 10 years, we will see a big serial production of Armata. Now it's a bit too expensive for a Russian army, and if we think about it, we will see that there is no enemy for T-14 Armata now. It's just, I think it's too complex, and maybe it's just more cost effective to use T-72B3 and T-90M tanks.
Well, time will tell whether or not that's the case, but it's very interesting to get that kind of perspective. Can I end on a slightly flippant note, maybe? There have been some videos on social media and some pictures on the internet showing a few accidents that took place during the event. For instance, a K-17 Boomerang infantry fighting vehicle caught fire. Now, I don't know if that's some sign of some kind of design flaw in this vehicle, or just a spontaneous accident that only occurred yesterday on the parade.
It can be both, because Boomerang is not yet accepted to armed forces, and it's still ongoing some trials. So I think it could be both some constructive problems, or it can be some spoilage, maybe some detail was produced with a spoilage. I don't know. This is almost unreal to understand just looking at this video or at these photos.
Yeah.
So that's not a rare thing to see some spoilages and spoilage parts in Russian military equipment.
Right. And finally, another mishap at the event was the fact that the French ambassador's car was almost hit by an absolutely gigantic T-15 BMP as it was driving away. So I wonder, Leonid, if this was an attempt to reenact the Battle of Borodino.
That was a good joke, Ben. I think that fixing the T-15 should be much easier and cheaper than fixing the Citroën C6 car of the French ambassador. So French guys should be a bit more careful and drive better, so they will save.
Certainly in their
cars.
interests. I will add, for the benefit of any listeners, that nobody was injured in this particular incident. Leonid, thank you very much indeed for your time. And for more on this story, I would ask listeners to visit our website, www.shepherdmedia.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Bye.
This episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast was brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Viasat. As always, a big thanks to everyone who took the time in being a part of the episode. And for our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and tell a friend or a colleague about the podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening.